environment and disaster management and other classes. So let's start today's class. So we have, always we'll start with the lecture plan. So before starting the class, going into the lecture and details of today's questions, I would like to introduce to you two important booklets for mains 2023. The International Relations MIB and International Relations Current Affairs for 2023. Let's have a look at these booklets. So yeah, this is the MIB booklet. Yeah, what actually counts in international relations? Like what actually make a very good answer in IR stand out compared to an average answer? So these, what exactly add-ons you have to add into your generalistic? Many of you have been facing this issue, like you have been writing some kind of very generalistic answer. To go a step ahead, to include some kind of specificity, some kind of exactness, accuracy into your answer paper, that is the original purpose of this booklet series. Like around 55 pages, you get overall all the syllabus coverage of international relations. And this is the first challenge which I already addressed, like bringing kind of specificity into your answer writing. Secondly, what next I really want to address through these booklets is many of you might have faced the issue of like you already know the content, you have read the content from multiple places, but you are not somehow able to recollect these points during the examination. So what exactly is a strategy for this? In ethics, you might have remembered during these workshop classes, we have developed different frameworks for how to approach different questions. If you have at least apply one framework in an answer, generating 5-6 points on every dimensions becomes quite easy. So regarding IR, what we can do here? So we have already discussed during the last time when we had done the IR, the PYQ classes, we have discussed a very comprehensive framework for international relations. And during PYQ, almost last 5 years, if you look, out of the 20 questions that is being asked, around 18 questions you can directly apply this framework. So this is a broad picture framework we will discuss in the class later on. And this whole material is designed in such a way in according to that framework. So if you arrange your study as well as your answer writing approach in line, that makes the whole process quite easy. So this is the second primary objective of these booklets. You can see here, like this is a long list of different keywords you can use in your answers, like soft power, there is definition of the specific keyword, there is in what context the keyword is coming in the news, which this will give a broad idea on where the keyword you can use in the answers. There are some specific keywords you should be used in ASEAN, some in SAARC. So all this context is also given, like this new regionalism approach. New regionalism approach, where you will see in which group context you will see the new regionalism approach. Something that is very specific to ASEAN. If a question came on ASEAN and you cite this keyword, there is obviously going to advantage in your answer is always going to stand out. So 3 columns are given, the definition as well as on which context this keyword is in news. Going ahead, suppose we have to discuss one country, like we'll start with like international organization. A broad list of organization is also covered in the booklet, like ASEAN, BRICS, SCO and all this. If you start with a country like India, Pakistan, there are different perspectives how to think on. For comfort level, take India, USA. How there is a broad perspective how you should think different dimensions, and broad 3 dimensions we have identified is first on the values. What are the values, common values between India and USA? You can cite the constitutional principles, you can cite constitutional morality, you can cite the common history of freedom movement, anti-colonial movement. Similarly, that is all about the values. In values, you can also include the socio-cultural, if something is you can relate to. You can also relate to some recent political activities. If in the context of India, China, you can always cite the Panchsheel principles. Similarly, what are the guiding values, historical context of the relations between two countries? That is the first category you should prepare or you should come into mind when you're going to write answer regarding any country. Second category is the national interest perspective. And what all comes in national interest perspective? It is the economic interest between the two countries. It is the technological convergence between the two countries. It is the trade issues between the two countries. it is if border issues is going on, border issues between the two countries, every all these aspects will come under the national interest perspective. Now the third perspective is strategic perspective. So you should think when you are going to generate points, what are the points of conflict between India and China, you should think on these dimensions. In strategic means something which have a long-term consequences. What all you think from strategic, like defense deal is happening, or climate change or disaster management aspect is happening, or any new deal or trade deal or something like that is coming up, like IPEF have come, A2U2A question has came in last year. Something like that, as new came, that all come under the strategic aspects. Climate mitigation initiatives, climate goals of 2020, net zero, everything will come under this strategic aspect. So these are the broad three areas you should think and frame points, and these three areas are all covered in the, regarding all the major countries, you can expect a question are covered under this material. Similarly, this is more about the static international relations. Similarly, if you look at the current affairs, we have mains edge material which broadly covers all the current affairs topics related to international relations in news in the last 1 year, 1.5 year. So one primary objective in designing this book and all is, like, strict focus is given on not overdoing, not overwriting something. Like, it is only 28 pages, you can still, if you at least devote a few hours, you can cover this booklet, and it has coverage of around 20-30 topics. So that's quite broad number of topics under in 28 pages. So here also, like, different acronyms given by Prime Minister, like Sagar Initiative, 5S. Can you read here if you can, if it is visible? Like 5S, like Samman, Samvad, Sahyog, Shanti and Samriddhi. All these different acronyms given by Prime Minister in different platforms. Broad list of these acronyms is provided. Then different organization, public international organizations, different contexts, that is policy initiatives taken by India. All these, what happened in last framework of last 1.5 years in detail is covered within this initiative. Like you can see here, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, INSTC, India's newfound interest in FTAs, IPEF. We already had question today regarding these topics. Software diplomacy, diaspora, all these are covered in this material. So these two material you can download from the Telegram channel, and you can make use of it for mains 2023. So in this background, let's go back to our original purpose today of discussing the question, like these two booklets download from the Telegram group. Now we will have a fair discussion. These are the 6 questions we have for today, starting from Indian Antarctic Act 2022 question. Then we have a question on FTAs, then INSTC, International North-South Transport Corridor, then Abraham Accords, IPEF, International Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Then we have why BRICS is quite important over G7 in the present context. We have 6 different dimensions, question from 6 different dimensions that has been more or less always in news in the recent past. So how this is the general framework you could approach for almost every question in IR. This should be your general approach to every answer. This is what I was trying to convey regarding when we were seeing this MIB booklet. For every country, you think based on shared values. You can think based on shared values as well as you can think based on conflicting values also. For example, you can, if you are speaking on India-China relations, like there is shared values. What is a shared value? Like aspirations of a developing country, economic objectives, all this comes under shared values. Why? What is the conflicting values? Like India has strong roots with democracy, where Chinese system doesn't have such a root appreciation for democracy. So these kind of conflicting values, communism versus democracy, or you can also think on these perspectives. In national interest, like broader dimensions, you can see in the next slide. These are all the areas which you can say. This is why historical is important. When we discuss something about India-US relations, it's always important to start your thought process from common historical struggles, like common anti-colonial struggles. Then you build your answer, you bring this aspect in the introduction, you can bring this aspect in some arguments or substantiation or something. Then you think about the political values like democracy, secularism. if specifically about try to by heart this partial, even though the direct question is not coming or you may not be listing this like this, you can use every of these points in context of many countries, especially if a question came from neighborhood first policy or any of the countries related to neighborhood. Last year we had a question from India Sri Lanka relationship. So all these areas, these partial principles are very quite important. You can have wide range of applications in IR answers. Similarly, if any recent high level political visits by prime minister or president happen, make a note of it. You can also think from that perspective. Similarly, the national interest dimensions, the most important dimension, the economic dimension, what all comes in economic, like import, exports. If you are speaking in terms of economic dimension for every country, try to at least remember some most basic data. Like what is the trade deficit of India with respect to China? What is India's total trade deficit? For FY23, it is around 265 billion US dollars. And out of this 265 billion US dollars, we have around 72 billion only trade deficit with China. So remember some of the most basic data regarding every aspect of this. Similarly, the social aspect, if there is like African students are studying in India, ASEAN University has been formed in the recent past. Similarly, skill development initiatives have came in the recent past, you put it here. Healthcare, digitech, other tech, all any technical collaboration is happening. Like AI is coming, there has been collaboration for building regulations for AI. There has been collaborations in different aspects in space technology, space diplomacy is gaining momentum. So in all these aspects, you try to connect it with the social dimensions and you can build a point. Similarly, security aspect like border security, coastal security, drug trafficking, especially when we are discussing in context of neighboring countries, money laundering, environmental issues, all this come under the national interest perspective. Similarly, we have one more third dimension, that is a strategic. That is if you have any specific doctrine to be followed with respect to the different country. Like if it is with respect to Pakistan, you can speak about Dowell doctrine. If it is related to any of the neighboring country, you can always cite Gurjar doctrine in your answers. Similarly, countering China, you can see even in today's answer, even though there is no direct question on China, many of our answers are somehow or other related to, there are context of Chinese will always come into answers. So how to use this, you can make use of it. Then terrorism perspective, anti-terrorism initiatives by India, the rule of law, non-alignment movement, multipolar world vision, all these concepts you can come under the strategic dimensions. So these are 86 dimensions. If one takeaway from this class, you just by heart this slide and by heart the different positions of this. If you think in this dimension, it becomes quite straightforward to develop points in any of the questions regarding international relations. In this context, let's discuss the first question. If you have not written the question, pause the video, brainstorm what you're going to write in this question, then we will continue. Yeah. So the first question is, the Indian Antarctic Act 2022 expands and regulates Indian research activities in Antarctica. Elaborate. How Antarctica is significant to India. So there are a few dimensions which where I literally doesn't want anyone to make a mistake, especially if you are somebody who is going to write exam this year. Like in ethics answer also, we have continuously been seeing these kind of mistakes. Like if a question is being asked, there is exactly certain objective points which you should cite or objective dimensions on which you can get marks. Should always keep in this mind. It is not about writing what you know into the paper and filling the papers. You should not write answers from the perspective of what you know, and you should always try to meet exactly what is the demand of this question. Come back to this question. Like we have, it's a 10 marker question, so we have 2 pages to fill. 2-line introduction you got, 2-line conclusion you got. Now how you are going to utilize the space in between? First, here you can directly see 2 different parts of the question. First part is, how is this act expands and regulate Indian research activities in Antarctica? That is the first part of the question. So you can give a headings like this, how this act important. Then almost 50% of the available space. That is almost first page of the answer. You should elaborate. You should give attention to the first part of the question. You should write about the act. You should write about different features of the act and bring out how it helps in meeting certain regulatory as well as expanding objectives of India in Antarctica. In the second part of the question and paper, you can write how Antarctica is significant to India. This will be around 50% of the paper, and here you generate around 5 points, here you generate around 4-5 points. That will suffice, 1 point in intro, 1 point in conclusion. That will suffice the thumb rule that you are generating at least 10 points for a 10-marker question. So nobody should commit a mistake here. You should not make a diagram on different features of the act first, then try to expand, write on how these features are going to expand India's. I'm not saying the approach is wrong or completely out of the context. This approach is also right. But the problem is we only have 2 pages and we have already 2 different parts to address. So it is always better try to hit the bullseye. If you know too much about the act, use that in introduction, 2-3 lines and stop there. After that, directly come into exactly what is asked in the question. So always keep this in mind. So this will be our framework. This will discuss for every answers we are going to discuss. Now, how we are going to address this question? I already told we have 2 parts. Then we have an introduction and a conclusion. What can be the introduction to this answer? Give me a broad perspective on what directions you can give in the introduction to this. Everything you start when we have to write on any government scheme, any totally different government scheme or new legislation that has came up recently, always try to answer this question, why? Why this XYZ legislation came up in present? For legislation you can think about a recent legislation, something like this, Article 370, that's quite a big legislation, but why that came up right now? Or you can speak about the Food Security Act of 2013. Why that legislation came out during that time? Preparing that, half of your work is in understanding the basic dimensions of context, why the XYZ legislation. If you look at this Indian Antarctic Act of 2022, this act really came up because India is already a part of Antarctic Treaty. And if India is already a part of Antarctic Treaty, there is a need for having national legislation to implement XYZ provisions of this treaty. There is a need for having a national legislation to implement the XYZ provisions, XYZ demands, XYZ visions of this treaty. So that is a primary context. Secondly, if you have been reading about these international relations in last 1 year or 2 years, you might have came across the increasing interest in Antarctic. In Arctic, you might have seen the melting of ice has facilitated the opening of new transport corridors through the Arctic Ocean. Now, this has increased the economic significance of Arctic and all these countries along this pathway. Similarly, the interest along Antarctic is also increasing. It's not just about, even you might have in prelims, you might have came across the Indian research station at Antarctic, the Maitri research station. So for different geopolitical, geographic, economic reasons, the interest in Antarctica is increasing. So these are the 2 major factors that why Indian government has came up with a certain act to regulate different activities happening in the Antarctic region. So you can start your answer in introduction by defining the context of this act, why the XYZ act came into existence. Now let's try to discuss the first part of this answer, that is, what exactly is the first part of the answer, like how this act expands and regulates Indian research activities. Expands and regulates Indian research activities? One thing you need to keep in mind, like even if you don't know too much about Antarctic Act, what are the exact provisions of the act? What are the exact XYZ features of the act? You might have forgotten, or you might have read somewhere, you might not able to recollect complete provisions of the act. Still, this is a question you should attempt very well, and you can obviously meet the demand of the question. And you will find this difficulty in many of the questions. There is only a few number of questions, there will be information abundance. In most of the question, you will have the deficit of information, and you have to address this with minimum level of information, how you can meet the demand of the question. So what you have to write here is how this act expands and regulates Indian research activities. Suppose this act is about Antarctica, regulation of XYZ activities that is going on in Antarctica. So what all this act can contain? Even if you don't know too much about the act, what all this act can contain? Can think from aspects of different stakeholders. Who are the different stakeholders? The most important stakeholders is Antarctica, the continent itself. Second most important stakeholder, the Indian programs that is going on there. Third, people who are part of this program. So these are different stakeholders who is part of this legislation. Now, what can be the legislation for each of these different activities? For Antarctica, what does this legislation contain? It contains, we are already polluting every part of the world. So don't pollute Antarctica. Environmental protection provisions. We already know Antarctica is a global common. Like space, it is a global common. Like this, it is not commercial property, or it is not a extension of any of the state. Every state has equal role in maintaining Antarctica or in having affairs of Antarctica. So this status quo should be maintained. There should be environmental protection. There should be strict pollution control measures for any activities that is going on in Antarctica. And strict pollution control measures mean there should be strict waste management and disposal systems that is in line with the demands of Antarctica continent. So all this will be what is regarding Antarctica, the provisions under the legislation. This you can guess even if you don't know too much about what contains the act. The second about Indian programs. It defines a Indian Antarctic program, IAP. The legislation defines an Indian Antarctic program that comprehensively, collectively bring together all different activities that has been going on in Antarctica. So here you need some specificity. If there is a program, there should be fund allocation to it. So the legislation also defines an Antarctic fund. Antarctic fund. Now what this legislation will be doing, there will be research happening. There will be so much of research interest in Antarctica, and what kind of researches can happen, what kind of activities are completely banned. Everything will be covered under this. What kind of activities will be completely banned in Antarctica? I already told Antarctica is a global common. So there will not be any permission for commercial mining, or there will not be any permission for commercial gas exploration or nuclear testing. All these kind of activities are completely banned in Antarctica. Similarly, if for regulating, like we have kept so much of provisions, and there is penalty for any XYZ people or organization that is violating this act. Up to 20-year imprisonment is the highest penalty under these provisions of the act. To regulate all these provisions, we have Indian Antarctic Authority. It will act as an independent regulator, which will make sure that the different provisions of the act is carried out. Now the third stakeholder, if you think from people's perspective, what does the people demands? Antarctica is already, it's a geographical extreme. There is climatic extreme, there is difficulties associated with the location in conducting research or approaching the area. So there is always need to define and enforce certain safety standards. And this is exactly what the act does. So these, on these dimensions you should ponder upon, and you should write this 5-6 different specific points, and that will meet the second part of our answer. I hope the second part is clear. First part of the answer is clear. Let's move ahead. Now come to the second part of the answer. How Antarctica is significant to India? How Antarctica, how will you answer this question? How Antarctica, we already told research is one of the key objectives of Antarctica. And what kind of research is going on in Antarctica? Or regarding climate change? Climate change researches are going on. What kind of climate change researches? You might have already seen the glacier melting happening. You might have already seen the ice melting is happening in Antarctica. So that is an indicator on different levels of sea level rise that is going to happen, or different levels of global warming that is happening in the world. So climate change aspect is one of the major research interest in Antarctica. Similarly, you can connect it with other aspects like dormant viruses. Other issues like dormant viruses that is coming up after maybe like it has been inactive for millions of years, but due to this global warming it is exposed to much alive situations and it is coming back. These kind of permafrost issues you see in the northern hemisphere, this can happen here also. Third different dimensions, what you can think is research aspects, ozone hole issues. So in different perspective, Antarctica is a research hub. Like there is so much, even in atomic physics, you might have seen some neutrino experiments that is being conducted, because there is high concentration of neutrinos naturally available in Antarctica. So due to this, there is so much of atomic physicists are also interested in studying Antarctica. So much of different aspects of physics are somehow interconnected with the research activities that is going on in Antarctica. Then this is one of the most primary significance or interest in Antarctica. The second, we can think about the economic aspects. We already told that Antarctica is a global common and the commercial mining activities or commercial exploration activities are completely banned in Antarctica. Being said, it is not like any new opportunities can come up in the future like we have seen in the Arctic. So India should be a stakeholder during that time. So the economic other aspect you can think is from marine resources perspective. Antarctic Regulation Act is not simply about Antarctica, it is about of the Antarctic Ocean also. So regarding there is so much of marine wealth, how to regulate this, how to exploit this, how to utilize this, everything is also a part of different activities that is going on in Antarctica, and it has so many economic significance. Moving ahead, what else you can think? Strategic, what is the strategic importance of Antarctica? I already told Antarctica regulation also regulates the Antarctic Ocean also. We are speaking about Antarctic Ocean, it connects Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean as well as Indian Ocean. So there can be connectivity facilities in the future. So there is scope for strategic engagements. Similarly, you can write for like international cooperation. You might have heard about space diplomacy which India is leading. Similarly, if Antarctic becomes an important economic zone in the future, India can have a stake in it. India can lead its research, India can share its data with other countries. India can share research resources like the laboratory or other resources, equipments with other countries. There is so much scope of collaboration that is possible with other countries who are also conducting similar researches in Antarctica. And the last point you can raise is the prestige issue or India's position in global affairs or global governance. If tomorrow any new regulations or legislation is coming off regarding Antarctica, if India has a strong presence with a strong national legislation in Antarctica, India will have access to the law-making tables of this XYZ organization, similar to Antarctic Treaty System. If new changes has to be made, India has a voice in this treaty system. So from different perspective, you can think like research, economics, strategic, international cooperation, prestige, or global governance perspective. All these aspects, Antarctica is quite significant to India. Generate 5-6 points on this regard, your answer will be sufficient. And what you will write in the conclusion, Antarctica is not of commercial interest right now, but it is one of the most wealthiest or most crucial part of the global governance system, and India should continue to play a proactive role in this. On this regard, you can conclude the answer. Let's move ahead. So go through the second question. If you have not written the answer, at least brainstorm what you're going to do in this question. Then we will continue. Yeah, the second question is, if you're watching online, you can pause the video, then continue after brainstorming or writing the answer. So the second question is, recently India has shown interest in signing FTAs with countries like UK and Canada. Examine factors driving India's pursuit of FTAs and how they would impact India's geopolitical standing. So it's a 10-marker question, very direct, straightforward question. What are the different dimensions you are going to write and how you are going to utilize the space available to you? Here also there is no so much confusion. You should write a 2 or 3 line introduction, 2 or 3 line conclusion. Now 2 different questions are asked. Factors driving India's pursuit of FTAs. This should be your first 50%. That should be your first 50% of the answer. Second 50% answer should be how they would impact on India's geopolitical standing. This should be next 50%. And 2 line conclusion. This should be your answer. At least 4 or 5 points here, 4 or 5 points here. You will meet the demand of the question. Very straightforward question. There is no way for confusion. Let's understand how you are going to write this. What you will write for introduction? Recently, India has shown interest in signing FTAs with countries like. So there is a statement given. So in most of the question I discussed this, told this earlier also. In question where there is a statement given and there is a totally different question that is asked, or on a different dimension a question is asked. So it is always better, there is not too much marks on the statement. It anyway doesn't carry too much marks. So use a statement for introduction. In the